Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are once again going to talk on liberal theory of Indian state. Dear friends, in our previous session also we tried to understand the topic, and as we have more and more content for you under this topic, so here we are where we are going to talk on liberalism in context to Indian state. Friends, for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhat College, University of Delhi. Dr. Jha is a prolific professor, and his dynamism always helps us out in understanding the in-depth knowledge, and he gives the in-depth knowledge on the various topics, and it becomes easier for us to know different topics in detail. So friends, today also we are going to get more and more knowledge through him. If you wish to ask question concerning to today's topic, or if you have queries regarding the previous session which we took on liberal theory of Indian state, then also you can ask questions if you have any. And for contacting us, you can contact us through our toll free number, that is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. This is our toll-free number through which you can call us and ask questions directly from Dr. Satish Kumar Jha on today's topic, that is liberal theory of Indian state. Friends, now I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, once again. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika ji, and good afternoon. In fact, today is the second part of our two-part series on liberal theory of Indian state. Today is the part 2. In fact, what we discussed in the first part, I would like to just recapitulate some of the salient features of our first part discussion on this topic. In fact, in our earlier discussion, I touched upon the issue of liberalism, that how liberalism has evolved in the West and what are the liberal values, and accordingly I also mentioned that how Indian liberalism is understood, how liberal values in Indian constitution and Indian state are analyzed. But at the same time, we also looked at this issue, that how this state, because today's topic is liberal theory of Indian state. So how this entire issue of state, government and system, this distinction has been there among scholars while discussing the Indian state in particular. And in that context I mentioned that how due to behavioral evolution, structural functional advent of a structural functional method, in fact many political scientists working on India in fact abandoned this category of a state for a more popular category those days, that was the political system. Some of them even preferred government. But in what happened by 80s, the state has made a powerful comeback. Even those who were earlier using system, government and other such categories, they started using state instead of system and government. For example, I mentioned the name of Rajni Kothari, Lloyd and Susan Rudolph and many other political scientists working on India, or one can say that Indian observers and analysts of Indian political scenario. So this is one thing. The second issue we also looked at in our earlier lecture was this colonial modernity, how it was responsible for the rise of certain set of values and ideals in India, because it is in context of colonial modernity that the first generation or first wave of liberalism emerged in India, with Indian elites, particularly the freedom movement in context of a nationalist movement. Those elites basically aspired for those liberal values which were prevalent in the West, be it freedom, be it equality, justice, freedom of press, rule of law and so on and so forth. So this is in context of the colonial modernity and the nationalist movement, the freedom movement, that we touched upon this issue, that how liberalism started taking roots on Indian soil, particularly in 19th century and early 19th century and continued even later. So therefore this is one important aspect we should remember if we discuss the liberal theory of Indian state, because as I mentioned earlier also, and again I would like to repeat, that liberalism has basically come in India in two important waves, one can say the second wave of liberal values and liberal thought emerged in 20th century, where we find that the new trends which were also making headway in West, particularly harmonizing certain aspects of socialism, particularly Fabian brand of socialism along with welfare state, and harmonizing those values with the classical liberal values and classical liberal predilections. For example, harmonizing group rights along with individual rights, economic development and states intervention in economy for the purpose of the welfare, and so on and so forth. So, this is how we find that a second generation or second wave of liberalism in India, which in my opinion basically surfaced in 20th century, and here in fact those values which were earlier associated with socialism became prominent. So, this is also something which we discussed in our last lecture. But one thing we should remember here, that when we discuss liberal theory of a state, we have to discuss this topic in from the two different points of view. One is that how liberal principles or liberal values as it is understood in political theory or in political philosophy, how those values are enshrined in Indian constitution, how Indian state, which basically derives its legitimacy and power from constitution of India, how those values find place in that document, and secondly how those principles and values have been upheld by the political class, how that those values and principles have been upheld by the various institutions and apparatus of a state. So, therefore, if we have a discussion of both the principles and values as enshrined in the constitution as well as their implementation, their enforcement, the conduct, or one can say the functioning of institutions and various functionaries of the state, it will be will be able to have some idea that how liberal theory of a state can be understood in India, or how Indian state reflects some of the liberal principles, or one can say that whether Indian state is functioning or conducting its activities as per liberal liberal worldview or liberal discourse. So, this is something important, and this is what I would like to do today. First of all, I will discuss some of the liberal principles, well established liberal principles of both sorts, the classical as well as the later developments of liberalism, because what happened that liberalism as can be considered a very dynamic set of ideas and principles which have evolved over the ages, particularly in modern time, and from time to time liberal thinkers of different hues have made modifications, have enriched it through number of new insights, new reflections, so much so that even in recent times, in our contemporary times, what is referred to as contemporary liberalism, this entire innovation, creativity, and one can say the enrichment of a whole corpus of ideas referred as liberalism is going on. So, therefore, one can say that when we look at those liberal principles, in order to analyze the liberal theory of a state in India, we have to have understanding of liberalism in a very broad sense of the term, that how liberalism over the ages have embraced and incorporated principles from principles of different types. One cannot restrict one's discussion only to the classical liberalism of Adam Smith and Ricardo's variety, or one can say what is called rugged liberalism, similar sort, or rather one has to include even the later developments. Now, it is in this context I was referring to in my earlier lecture, rather I discussed in more detail that how some scholars have engaged or have debated this issue, that can liberalism be applied to Indian situation, can Indian constitution be called a liberal document, can Indian state be characterized as a liberal state, and in that context I specifically mentioned the debate between Sunil Khilnani and Rajiv Bhargava on basis of idea of India, that book written by Khilnani, and one of the papers of Rajiv Bhargav, which can be considered as a response to Khilnani, that is basically a vision for democratic vision of a paper which appeared in edited book edited by Franz and Frankel. So, this debate I referred to in my earlier lecture, that how Khilnani believes that in India liberalism came as in a fit of absent-mindedness, and how he basically believes that this entire emphasis on community, on group rights basically dilutes liberal principles, whereas Rajiv Bhargav had altogether different point of view to offer, and this is we discussed in our last lecture. I also mentioned K.M. Panika, particularly his that celebrated work on Indian liberalism, that K.M. Panika also refers to that different strands of liberalism. On the one hand, if you have a classical liberalism in the West, on the other hand we also have had people like Green, and many other liberal thinkers who were quite sensitive to group and community identities. They were not as individualist perhaps as the classical liberals. So, similarly Panika argues that in India also you can have different hues of liberalism. So, this debate we referred to in our earlier discussion. After recapitulating what we discussed in our last lecture, in order to establish a kind of linkage between the two parts, what I would like to do today is to look at two different, to discuss this issue from two different points of view. One, that how liberal principles are enshrined in Indian constitution. On basis of those enshrinement, or one can say on basis of or one can say that on basis of the reading of Indian constitution or the text, can we say that liberal principles are very much there enshrined, and therefore Indian constitution is in accordance with the high tradition of liberalism. Then we also have to see that if those principles and those ideals and those values have been enshrined, then whether those principles and those values have been upheld in practice, or there have been deviations and digressions, or on basis of those deviations and digressions what conclusions one can draw. Can we say that the liberal theory of a state, the way it is understood within in political theory, in the same way can we say that Indian state is liberal in its orientation, and therefore the proper understanding of a state in India would require that it should be tested on basis of the liberal principle. So, this is something what I intend to do in today's lecture. Now, first of all we should have a look at it. First of all, we should discuss one issue, that what are the liberal principles and how those principles find their place in India's constitution. And in this context, what becomes important, that how this entire constitution was drafted, the drafting of the constitution, that is Constituent Assembly, the role of Constituent Assembly. Of course, in fact the time does not allow us to go into this issue of the detail of drafting of the constitution, particularly Constituent Assembly. But one thing is very important, that the Constituent Assembly played very important role so far as enshrinement of liberal values in the constitution are concerned. Of course, the Constituent Assembly was formed on basis of cabinet mission plan. It was basically done during the colonial period. Authority was exercised by the British monarch through British Parliament, but nonetheless, when the assembly was formed, once the assembly met, then perhaps the elites, Indian elites, or one can say that the modern particularly modern elites, or one can say that liberal oriented elites who joined Constituent Assembly, they played an important role in producing this valuable document which is called Constitution of India, a document which in certain respects it is believed that was ahead of its time, because this is something very significant, that 1946 to 1949, when the Constituent Assembly met and drafted this constitution, tried to bring in both individual and group rights, because liberalism embraced this thing much later, particularly after advent of multiculturalism, communitarianism, and so on and so forth. Even Universal Declaration of Rights of United Nations didn't take cognizance of group rights, but 1946 India's constitution basically looked at these issues, addressed these issues, incorporated them. So, it was a great achievement from the point of view of time frame, that how it was ahead of its time. Number of innovations it made, and therefore one can say that of course one of the criticism was that there was nothing new, there was nothing novel, there was nothing innovative, everything was copied from the West. And in this context Ambedkar's reply was quite important. He said that at the so late in the day, what can be so original so far as the drafting of the constitution is concerned, but the way various values, principles of constitutionalism were sought to be brought, or one can say that sought to be harmonized with the concrete Indian situation, that was some sort of innovation for the Indian elites who were in the Constituent Assembly, and one can say the makers of the constitution, founders of the Indian Republic, or one can say the visionaries who envisioned a different type of India. The kind of idea they had in their minds about future India were really something very noble. What is normally referred to as Republican India, what is normally referred to secular democratic Republican India. So, therefore, this is something important, that how constitution was drafted, and in this context we should remember the role of this new class, that is the middle class, because middle class always plays important role so far as liberal values is concerned, because one should remember that even in West, be it Reformation, Renaissance, or the great revolutions, French Revolution, American War of Independence, a glorious revolution, it was basically the rise of the new class. This is the which is normally referred to in social science literature as bourgeoisie, but nonetheless this bourgeoisie also was a middle class at that time, and therefore this middle class becomes very important, a bearer of these values, the champion of rights, freedom, equality and justice, because these things were written on their flag, their banner, when they fought against aristocracy, when they fought against monarchy, when they fought against papacy. So, therefore, the role of the middle class, and this is something this is not very new thing so far as the role of middle class in the development of political institutions is concerned, and political institutions have important role in liberal discourse. For example, Aristotle, the great Greek thinker, talked about the role of middle class in the stabilization of political institutions. In this context, one should remember that when we compare India with Pakistan, many Pakistan observers or scholars working on Pakistan, they refer to this fact, this fact that the middle class could not develop in Pakistan because of certain objective conditions prevailing at that time, and therefore what happened, that institutions could not become very stable, and the kind of the short lifespan which we saw in the democratic governments in the Pakistan at times is referred to this absence of a powerful middle class, unlike India, which took firm shape during colonial period and continued to grow even later. So, therefore, this middle class is important, and its role in championing liberal values, in basically carrying this liberal worldview is always important, and in India, therefore, we find that this middle class has played important role from the reform, social religious reform movement, where we have had people like Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Rana De, and many others, and even later when the phase of political activism and political movement came, when the Congress was founded, the first wave of liberalism continued rather one can say that moved from societal and cultural realm to political realm, when the moderates came on the scene, be it Dadabhai Nauroji, Firoz Shah Mehta and many other moderates leader, and even later when the Constituent Assembly was formed, and there we find that this middle class, how important role they played in institutionalizing liberal values and liberal worldview. So, therefore, the role of middle class for liberalism and liberal worldview is important, and it is in this context we should remember their important role in India. Now, what we find that this Constituent Assembly therefore has played important role, and the way they drafted this constitution, the way they created this document, and the way they incorporated various principles, liberal principles, which can enable any neutral observer to come to this conclusion that Indian constitution is a liberal document, or one can say that any observer to come to this conclusion that the state, Indian state, which derives its power from this constitution, which derives its legitimacy from this constitution, is a liberal state, because the way it is constrained, the power is constrained by power, the way institutions are checkmated by one institution is checkmated by other, the way separation of power is is enshrined, the way rule of law is prominent in the entire constitutional document, all dominant and salient principles of liberalism are very much there, and therefore Indian constitution is a liberal document, and the state which basically functions on basis of these constitutional directives and principles is a liberal state in India. But the moot question is whether the conduct of the state, or one can say that whether these principles have been upheld in practice or not. What are the areas where one can say that there are digressions? What are the areas where one can find out blots or scars on this entire liberal liberal character of a state and constitution? So, these issues we have to discuss. Now, coming to this liberal principles, that what are the principles in the constitution, and where, in which parts, which section one can find them. To begin with, you have the preamble of the constitution, which came in form of objective resolution moved by Jawaharlal Nehru, and later on became the preamble of the constitution, which talks about three important values, liberal values: liberty, equality, justice, and not to forget fraternity, which is basically at times translated into Indian parlance as secularism, or one can say tolerance. So, therefore, fraternity, liberty, equality, justice, and fraternity, the four important cornerstone of any liberal worldview, one can say that are very much there in preamble, along with quest for peace, international peace, and harmony, and so on and so forth. So, therefore, preamble is a very important place where one can see liberal values speaking, or one can say the liberal values showing their face, particularly liberal values becoming very prominent. The second important section is the fundamental rights. And fundamental rights is one section which is very sacrosanct, and therefore, as it is well known that in India we have had a long fight between legislature and executive, legislature and judiciary, on the significance, or one can say the importance of fundamental rights, whether fundamental rights are negotiable or they are absolute. Of course, one thing we should remember, the rights are not absolute in any country, any constitution. They are always regulated, or one can say they are moderated. There are restrictions. United States of America, those restrictions have come through judicial pronouncements. In India, those restrictions have been written into the constitution itself. But one thing is important, that with those restrictions, rights are very sacrosanct, and this conflict between the legislature and judiciary in India was on this issue, that which is more important, fundamental rights or directive principles of a state policy, because it is well known that directive principles are in nature of directives, but the principles which find place in directive principles have tremendous significance from the point of view of socio-economic change, from the point of view of people's welfare, from the point of view of social and economic equality, from the point of view of social democracy. But on the other hand, fundamental rights are equally important from the point of view of individual liberty, autonomy, freedom, and and many similar values, also equality and justice, and fraternity, as tolerance or secularism. So, therefore, after preamble you have another important place is fundamental rights, then you have directive principles of a state policy, where you also find certain important liberal values, because one can one can mention here that any liberal society is not possible. To envision a liberal society in situation of deep inequality, in situation of great deprivation, in situation of hunger, in situation of illiteracy. So therefore, certain objective conditions are also required for creation and the functioning of a liberal society and liberal state. So therefore, directive principle of state policy is also equally important, if it is not from the point of view of individual liberty, then from the point of view of socio-economic equality, from the point of dignity, because only in a situation of equality that people can enjoy dignity. So therefore, directive principle of state policy is another place. Then you have rule of law, that what is the status of rule of law, because liberal world view is essentially premised on this principle of rule of law, equality before law, that everyone is equal, there is no hierarchy. And in Indian context it becomes very important, because from the very beginning it was believed that Indian society is a hierarchical society, and therefore in my last lecture also I had referred eminent sociologist Louis Dumont, when he wrote a book Homo Hierarchicus, comparing India with the West, where he believed that it was Homo Equalis. So therefore, this hierarchical society, and even Ambedkar's that famous speech in the Constituent Assembly, when he said that we are entering into life of contradiction, in politics we will have equality, but in society we will have inequality, and sooner we remove this hiatus, this kind of dichotomy between social and political realm, political sphere and the social sphere, it will be better for democracy. So therefore, the rule of law is another important principle, and we have to see that how rule of law comes into the constitution in a big way, and there is no denying the fact that it is very much there, and prominently this has been given a place in the Constitution of India, be it Article 14, equal protection of law, or many other similar provisions. So therefore, equality before law and equal protection of law, both British and American principles have been harmonized in Article 14 of the Indian Constitution. Then you have separation of power, a very important liberal doctrine, that how legislature, executive and judiciary have to be separated from each other, and this separation of power, even if it is not patterned on purely American type, because America has a different type of system, presidential federal system, with checks and balances and separation of power, clearly demarcated in the Constitution of India, in Constitution of United States of America. But India is a federal parliamentary federal system, and therefore it is a combination of both parliamentary principles and the federal principles. But nonetheless, there is a separation of power, and therefore judiciary and legislature, their zone of operation, their areas of action have been clearly demarcated and defined. And along with this separation of power, the entire issue of representation, which is cornerstone of a liberal polity. So this theory of representation, that how no taxation without representation, the way entire liberal discourse started in the West. Now how representation finds a very important place in India's constitution through electoral politics, and a particular very nuanced way in which representation has been understood and has been enshrined in the constitution, along with judicial independence and many other things like autonomy of individual, the idea of a limited state, that a state's power has to be checkmated, power a state cannot be made authoritarian, because limited state is a very important idea within the liberal worldview, along with the idea of civil society and so on and so forth. So all these liberal principles, we have to see that how they find place in Indian constitution and how they have functioned, whether they have upheld this liberal principle, and therefore can we characterize Indian state as a liberal state, or we have some other way to look at this question.
No, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, you're requested to be with us as we are back after a short break and would be discussing more. Till then, be with us and keep watching us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on liberal theory of Indian state, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Satish Kumar Jha on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. Friends, you are requested to call in the last 10 minutes of the lecture. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, once again. Hello, sir. Welcome to the lecture.
Thank you. In fact, in earlier session, today we are discussing that how liberal principles can be understood and how those liberal principles find their place in India's constitution. Or one can say that how Indian polity is governed on basis of those liberal principles. And in that context, I mentioned principles like liberty, equality, justice, fraternity, rule of law, separation of power, system of representation, political representation, independence of judiciary, and also autonomy of individual, idea of limited government and limited state, or one can say minimal state or limited government, and also the presence of a civil society institutions, because these principles one can broadly say that are important for the working of a liberal state, or one can say these principles are important for for any liberal society. So therefore, on basis of these principles one has to judge whether Indian state is a liberal state or not, and if it is a liberal state, then what are the areas which are areas of concern, and what are the areas where one can find some digression, some aberration. Now, to begin with, we have already discussed the role of middle class, particularly for any liberal society or for any liberal institutions earlier, that middle class has played important role world over, and India is no exception. And therefore, this middle class world view in India, which was wedded to this idea of modernity, and basically wedded to the idea of liberalism, that played important role in drafting of the constitution and creating a kind of legitimacy which political institutions required at that time. By conducting regular elections, for creating universal adult franchise, for basically upholding rule of law, and so on and so forth. So, therefore, this middle class role is there, and in India, in fact, there is no denying the fact that this middle class has also played important role. Then we discuss preamble, particularly liberty, equality, justice and fraternity, the liberal values, how they can be seen speaking through the preamble of the constitution. And we also discuss fundamental rights, a very important section in the constitution, that how liberty, equality, fraternity as tolerance, or one can say secularism, find important place in India's constitution in fundamental rights section, and therefore fundamental rights, one can say, is basically the lifeline of liberal values or liberal discourse in India's constitution. Now, in fundamental rights we have various sections. For example, you have sections dealing with liberty, individual liberty. We have sections dealing with articles dealing with equality. We have articles dealing with justice, both social and economic. Particularly, the way the justice has been institutionalized in Indian constitution is very complex and intricate. It is not that simplistic, because in my understanding, justice in India should be understood in three different frames: distributive justice, social justice and reparative justice, and therefore it is very nuanced understanding of justice we find in India's constitution. And along with equal liberty and justice and equality, because article 14 is a very important article which says equality before law and equal protection of law. The rule of law, which I was referring to, important principle, liberal principle, is at the very prominent place in India's constitution. Now, along with religious freedom, which is a very important freedom for liberalism and for liberal society, because every individual has to have a this liberty, freedom of religion, and article 25 in India's constitution is very important. Not only freedom of religion, but there are two other principles of secularism, the way it has been understood, because the way it has evolved, because secularism is an evolving doctrine, particularly from the point of view of the West, and this three principles over the years are considered to be the hallmark of any secular polity. One is religious freedom, another is separation of state and religion, or what is normally called disestablishment, and then of course you have the citizenship rights, that all citizens, irrespective of their social identities or hierarchies, have to have equal rights. And this is how E.D. Smith, one of the very important scholar on India's secularism, has also looked at this, that how these three principles can be seen in India's constitution, that is religious freedom, disestablishment and citizenship rights. And therefore, you have article 25, 26, 27 and 28 clearly explaining, defining and institutionalizing these three important freedom and three important rights. Now, of course, one can also see a number of provisions in this fundamental rights where individual liberty, which is very important right, individual right, and one can say that the entire liberal entire liberal worldview is anchored on this principle of freedom and equality. Now, this in articles like 19, 20, 21 and of course 32, the constitutional remedies through which the people, citizens can secure these rights. There is a special provision through which they can basically secure these rights. So, they tell you something, that how this freedom has been enshrined in India's constitution. Along with equality, as I was mentioning, article 14, equality before law and equal protection of law. 15 and 16, which talks about positive discrimination and also non-discrimination. So, in India, interestingly, non-discrimination and positive discrimination both have been spoken in the same breath. Of course, I do not have the time to go into detail, but in Constituent Assembly when both were being discussed, Ambedkar's take was quite significant. He said that non-discrimination is a rule and positive discrimination an exception. So, therefore, rule and exception have been combined in a very creative way in Article 15 and 16 in India's constitution. So, equality, another important liberal principle, and then as I mentioned, fraternity as secularism, or one can say fraternity as tolerance when you have Article 25, 26, 27 and 28, particularly 26, 27 and 28. Of course, 25 is freedom of religion, and then also Article 17, which abolished untouchability, because what happens that fraternity for any society, such social practice can be detrimental from the point of view of fraternity. So, abolition of untouchability, Article 17. Then rule of law, that how law should be supreme, everyone should be under the same law, there should not be, no one should be above law, and this liberal dictum has been basically upheld, or one can say has been enshrined, or one can say that finds place in India's constitution. And here we can refer to Article 14, of course, which I mentioned earlier, but also 20 and 21, when right to life, dignity are guaranteed, when no one can be punished according without the authority of law, or one can say that even if one is basically arrested, he or she has to be produced before a magistrate within 24 hours. Of course, here there is something other other provision also, which is called preventive detention, which is considered a blot on India's liberal character. Liberal character of the constitution, which we will discuss later. So, therefore, over the years this entire thing, Article 20 and 21 have been expanded creatively, so much so that dignity, education, clean air, clean water, all these things have been included within the purview of life and dignity, and therefore, this is ever growing, ever expanding provision in the constitution. So, therefore, one can say the rule of law, that everyone is equal before law and equal treatment of law, and along with that how life and liberty along with dignity have been secured in India's constitution is the best testimony that how this liberal principle has been given a very significant place in India's constitution and Indian polity. Now, another important aspect and liberal principle which I was referring to is separation of power. As all of us know in political science, that how Montesquieu, the great French philosopher, political theorist, propounded this theory of separation of power. Now, this is also considered a very important principle from the point of view of securing freedom and and from the point of view of securing liberty. So, therefore, the separation of power doctrine says that legislature, executive and judiciary should be separate. There cannot be an intermixing of their functions and their roles. Of course, United States of America is a classic example where this separation of power based on the Montesquieu principle has been basically upheld in letter and spirit. But in other constitutions, democratic constitutions, even if it is not a pattern on American style, presidential federal, nonetheless this separation of power in one way or other is basically incorporated, particularly from the point of view of upholding individual freedom. And in India, of course, similar thing has been done. Of course, India is not a presidential federal system like United States of America, rather it is a parliamentary federal system like many Commonwealth models of constitutionalism. But even in India we find that this separation of power is a very pious principle in the constitution. For example, a legislature has been barred from discussing the conduct of the judiciary or judges except through the motion of impeachment, and similarly the judges also have been barred from discussing the conduct of legislatures or interference in the working of the legislature. So, therefore, legislature and judiciary their spheres have been well demarcated. Of course, in recent years what we have seen that there are a lot of criticism for the judicial overreach, because it is believed that judiciary has started interfering in the conduct of of legislature. And of course, earlier also we saw a lot of conflicts arising in India on issue of parliamentary privileges and contempt of court, particularly particularly in the event of 2-3 important scandalous events, what is known as Jharkhand Mukti Morcha case, on which Supreme Court also made a very important landmark judgment, and cash for vote scam and many other things. In fact, the legislature invited the attention of judiciary, and judiciary lost no opportunity to basically pass judgment and making certain things of legislative conducts as justiciable or reviewable under judicial review. So much so that this basic structure doctrine given in Keshwanand Bharati case, what is basic structure was not well defined, and from the time to time the Supreme Court has started giving its definition of basic structure. For example, in famous Bomai case, it talked about secularism as a basic structure, and similarly in Jharkhand Mukti Morcha case, it talked about parliamentary democracy as a basic structure. And the moment basic structure comes into picture, then the Supreme Court believes that it is bounden duty to review or intervene or interfere, and therefore this separation of power doctrine, it is believed that is coming under stress in India. Recently, when judicial appointment commission issue came up, because judiciary, the way the appointment of higher judiciaries in India is done through collegium system has been a matter of debate, and when the legislature wanted to bring in the role of executive, the Supreme Court turned it down on basis of a case before it, and therefore what we find that this issue of separation of power, one can say, has come under stress, but this liberal principle of course is very much there in the Constitution of India. Now, another important liberal principle, which is right to property. Of course, it is a debatable thing, because the classical liberals talked about right to property. Here one can refer to John Locke as father of liberalism, and accordingly most of the liberal polities, constitutions have adhered to this Lockean principle. In India also we find that in Indian Constitution Article 31 talked about the right to property. There was of course a very very lively debate on this inclusion of this provision in the Constitution, but what we find that this also led to a long fight between legislature and judiciary, the Supreme Court. Judiciary, legislature on the one hand wanted to curb this right to property, and therefore wanted to give importance to directive principles of state policy, which basically bars concentration of wealth, and therefore wanted to use that directive principles to bring in social and socio-economic change and social and economic equality, and therefore made many amendments in the Constitution, starting with the first amendment when the 9th schedule was created, and when certain land reform related legislations were put in 9th schedule, and 9th schedule debarred the judiciary to declare them invalid on basis of the encroachment of fundamental rights. So, starting with first amendment to number of amendments, we can refer here 24th, 25th and so on and so forth, have in one way or the other been related to this right to property. But this entire matter got settled when 44th amendment in 1978, the Janata Party government abolished this right to property as a fundamental right and shifted to another section, to different section as a legal right, and 300A. So, therefore, this right to property as a liberal principle has been there as a fundamental right initially, but now only enjoying the status of a legal right. So, therefore, this is another important principle, that is right to property, you can see in India's constitution. Then the question of judicial independence, independence of judiciary, because people's, citizens' liberty and justice would depend on judicial independence. And here we find that India's constitution also makes provision for judicial independence. The way judges are appointed, the way judges are removed through the process of impeachment, particularly High Court and the Supreme Court judges. Though of course India has created a hierarchical system of judiciary from top to bottom, Supreme Court is standing at the top and the local gram panchayats, nyay panchayats at the bottom. But nonetheless, judicial independence has been enshrined. And recent years, of course, we have seen many controversies growing around this issue, that is judicial independence and interference. Recently, some judges also held a press conference and criticized their own Supreme Court and the functioning of the Supreme Court. But nonetheless, one can say that judicial independence as far as the constitution is concerned is very much and clearly mentioned and enshrined. Now coming to the another important liberal principle, that is autonomy of individual and the idea of limited state. This is very important, that how this autonomy of individual can be upheld and how this state can play a limited role. That is a minimal state, one can say, or minimal interference in the affairs of the society, because this is how the classical liberalism looked at it. Of course, there is another way in which liberalism looks at a state, that a state as a neutral agency. It is only has a mediatory role, and therefore it has a legitimacy. It is above societal interests and the class interests, unlike Marxist theory, which looks at a state as the agency of the ruling class. So therefore a state as a neutral agency. In India, in fact, Rajni Kothari, eminent political scientist, when he talked about Congress system, in fact he talked about power sharing among various groups, and also talked about the autonomy of the state from social and economic forces. And he believed that Indian state enjoyed a lot of legitimacy on account of A, its past antecedents in the national freedom movement, and B, because it was enjoying autonomy from the various societal forces and was basically trying to deliver good, was trying to do welfare measures, welfare work for the entire society. So it was not working at the behest of any particular interest. This is how he looked at it. Of course, he later abandoned this view when he said that a state's autonomy got eroded and it succumbed to a new tendency which he called techno-bureaucratic elites basically monopolize power. That is in his later writings. But the liberal theory of a state looks at a state as a neutral agency, and therefore it also expects a state to play a very minimal role in the affairs of a state and uphold the autonomy of individual. Now how this is done, how in India this minimal state principle has been upheld. Now we should remember that after independence, India started planning process, the 5-year plans under Nehruvian period, and at that time a state took upon its shoulder the responsibility to develop economy. So much so that many scholars have called it a developmental state, that a state was playing the agent, working as an agent for development in India, in order to bring social democracy, in order to equalize resources, in order to bring equality and social justice and economic justice, and so on and so forth. But we find that a lot of criticisms of this state intervention in economy and society even in those years. We should remember that how 1959 a Swatantra party of Rajgopalachari was formed, and that party remained there till 1974. It was it offered a very strident criticism of statism. Later on, the Bharatiya Janasangh, the earlier avatar of today's Bharatiya Janata Party, also talked about the free market economy and offered a critique of statism. So therefore we find that this debate about the minimal state or activist state, one can say, or interventionist state was there in India from the very beginning. But so far as Indian constitution and liberal principle is concerned, of course it talked about the individual autonomy, and therefore you have article 20, 21, right to life and right to liberty. and a protection before the magistrate within 24 hours of the arrest. Of course, we have discussed preventive detention. Of course, this security issue is often referred as a kind of blot on India's liberal character. So much so that in Constituent Assembly, Somnath Lahiri, a communist member of the Constituent Assembly, even criticizes, saying that rights are being understood or rights are given in the constitution from the point of view of a police constable. And in recently, Uday Singh Mehta, a political theorist and political scientist, has said that Hobbes not Locke can be considered the progenitor of India's constitution, because security, the principle of security, overtakes liberty in India's constitution. So these criticisms are there. But 1991 economic reforms, when liberalization started, neoliberal policies came on the scene. A concept of minimal state was again discovered, and the slogan like minimum government and maximum governance, such a slogan we heard in the political discourse. So therefore, we find that this governance issue, when it is basically seen from the point of view of state, market and civil society, particularly in neoliberal discourse, also emerged in India, and therefore this entire autonomy of individual and limited state has come in the new form. Of course, there are many criticisms of this issue also, particularly from the point of view of crony capitalism, the business politics linkages, that how this minimal state and the market mechanism, promotion of market mechanism are leading to crony capitalism. So this is how it is going on. But at the same time, the third, another important principle is the civil society, that how liberal tradition believes civil society as a realm of freedom since the days of Hegel, and Tocqueville basically took it to new height when he idealized American system, which was based on associational life. Now, of course, in India we find that a lot of we have a very vibrant civil society with many civil society organizations, NGOs, human rights organizations like PUDR, PUCL, but of course state civil society debate is also ranging here. Particularly after this Anna movement, this became very prominent. Now, of course, there are different twists and turns in this life of liberal state in India, and there are 4, 5, 6 important landmarks here. Emergency 1975, when suspension of rights was done, the right to property, the way it was abolished, then poverty and illiteracy, because this is believed to be leading to structural violence, and majoritarianism, the way minority rights against tyranny of the minority have always been upheld by liberal tradition, from John Stuart Mill to many other thinkers. Article 29 and 30 in India talks about minority rights, but today when a new debate is emerging on nationalism in India, this majority minority rights are also becoming important, and this is something very important for liberal state in India, that how it resolves it. Then of course the question of many other issues like identity politics, particularly the way it is a threat to fraternity, and the repressive apparatus of a state, particularly a fallout of the failure of the liberal politics, be it the Armed Forces Special Power Act in Northeast or Punjab or Kashmir. Punjab of course in 80s, but Kashmir today and Northeast. All these issues to some extent one can say are the blot on India's liberal character, but nonetheless on basis of principles and practice one can say that Indian state is a liberal state.
With this note, thank you sir, thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to write to us at info.cec@nic.in if you have any query or feedback you wish to give. We are going to meet again very soon and would be discussing more. Till then, take care, goodbye. Thank you sir, thank you once again.